Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, we're going to look at intimate partner abuse. So, an intimate partner is going to be somebody who's a spouse, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a dating partner, an ex-partner, ex-husband, or ex-wife. Intimate partner violence can be physical, sexual, or emotional. Physical abuse is going to be hitting, slapping, kicking, etc. Sexual abuse is any unwanted sexual contact, sexual coercion, or forcible rape. And emotional abuse are going to be things like threats to harm, restraint from freedom of regular activities, denial of access to resources like money or credit cards, the car, etc. There are two major categories of intimate partner abuse, and the first is going to be intimate terrorism. That's the need for power, control, and dominance, and involved is severe, persistent, and frequent abuse that escalates in seriousness over time that is likely to result in serious injury. There's also situational couple violence. This is also known as common couple violence, and that's the need for power and control is absent, but it's violence that results when conflict escalates out of control. And these exchanges begin as regular arguments, and they just escalate until they explode into violence. Originally, intimate partner violence was defined as a personal issue and something that law enforcement largely stayed out of. It was also when law enforcement started getting involved, then the definition began to be limited to physical violence. But over time and with research and more information, this definition has been expanded to include emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and physical violence altogether, all three. Also, for many decades, there was no such thing as forcible rape or sexual violence between a husband and a wife. And this was viewed as something that could only occur, and there was no definition of rape between same-sex partners. That was viewed as something that only could occur between a man and a woman. But this definition has evolved to incorporate husbands who can rape and women also as perpetrators of intimate and physical violence and sexual violence. Same-sex intimate partner violence is one reason that many people in same-sex partners, they don't go to the police when there is same-sex partner intimate violence because they believe they won't be taken care of, or believed by law enforcement that, there could be abuse between a woman and a woman or a man and a man. Also, not everybody is openly homosexual, and they're afraid of being outed to the public when they're not ready, and there's a lot of concerns about being outed, what will my parents think, what will my friends think, etc. So there are a lot of people in same-sex intimate partner violence relationships that simply keep the abuse a secret. There's also, like I said, that fear among the homosexual community of being demeaned or not believed or not taken seriously. So it's a highly underreported area for that group. Stalking is also something that happens in intimate partner relationships, and that is conduct that is unwanted and harassing. It causes fear in the individual being targeted. Stalkers show up at the individual's home, their work, their family's house, friend's house, provide repeated unwanted contact via, cell phones, text messages, emails, and threaten to hurt the victim or the victim's family members. Females are more likely to be victims of intimate partner violence and stalking than are males. And technological violence, such as access to like GPS, air tags that you can put on somebody's car or put on in their purse, unbeknownst to them, makes people unaware of the fact that they're being watched, they're being stalked, and it makes stalking easier for their intimate partners. Risk factors that increase the likelihood of intimate partner violence are going to be things like stress caused by financial shortcomings, just not having enough money to go around, starts arguments, it causes frustration, being overwhelmed by responsibilities like children and work. All of these things increase the likelihood of intimate partner violence. Cohabitation also increases the likelihood of intimate partner violence, and that's when two people live together but they're not married. So they have an intimate relationship, they share an apartment, they share a home, but they're not married. That circumstance of cohabiting with an unmarried partner actually is an increased risk factor for intimate partner violence. Power and the patriarchy is where the male of the relationship dominates the relationships, the finances, the household function, and they keep their partner submissive and under control. There is a social learning element to intimate partner violence. It's a learned behavior. So those who witness that kind of violence in the household growing up are more likely to repeat the behavior in their adult relationships than those who do not witness it growing up. They internalize it. It becomes reflexive behavior in addition to, acceptable to them definitions because this is how my family has always done it. And therefore they repeat the behaviors as they get older. Individuals with disabilities are at greater risk of intimate partner violence. Having a disability makes somebody more vulnerable than not having a disability. They can't flee, they can't defend themselves. In some cases, there's cognitive disabilities, so maybe they don't fully understand in all instances when they're being abused. And of course, like we always talk about, alcohol and drug use. Binge drinking is associated with intimate partner violence episodes, and the bulk of intimate partner victimizations report alcohol or drug use prior to victimization. So the outcomes of intimate partner violence include obviously injury. People get, sustain serious injuries, burns, lacerations, broken bones, dislocated shoulders, and other, sockets and so forth. 14% of all homicide victims, like we said, are victims as a result of intimate partner violence. So death is certainly one of those outcomes. Chronic victimization is very common here. This is a case where people are going to be victimized again and again and again. It's almost never a once and done incident. There will be repeat, which always begs the question, why do victims stay in these abusive relationships? There's a multitude of reasons, and the first one are emotional highs. So it's not always a relationship that's characterized by fear and violence. There are good times. There are emotional high times, which cause confusion and help anchor the person emotionally to that relationship. That, well, it's not always bad. Sometimes things are really good if I can just find a way to make it stay in the good spot. So that really anchors people to not wanting to leave. There's also something called the honeymoon phase. So early in the relationship, the abuser love bombs. I mean, that's a newer term, but they love bomb the individual with attention, and they tell them how wonderful they are and give them constant affection. But it's short lived. It's short lived. And they will often also, after battering and physically abusing the individual, reintroduce the honeymoon phase and the love bombing in order to anchor the person to the relationship, which again leads to confusion in the relationship, the inability to make a clean cut, and sort of this emotional gray area, which is why a lot of people don't leave. Financial dependence is a big one. One of the partners may be unemployed. Or maybe they are employed, but they're kept isolated from the funds. One of the abuser is in control of all the money, so that if and when you do decide to leave, how are you going to leave if you have none of the finances? And the final one is often that the couple shares children, and the person being battered doesn't want to break up the family or separate the kids from the parent, or the parent argues or presents to the abused person that if you take my kids, I'm going to escalate violence, or I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill you and the kids. So there are a lot of reasons that people stay, despite the fact that these are untenable, violent, unsafe relationships. Police response, like I said, this was historically viewed as a private matter, a fight between a couple that shouldn't be refereed by the police. However, over time, there was increased public outcry and increased awareness about the damage caused from domestic violence. So law enforcement became more and more central to managing the issue. In specific, a real watershed moment was some research that was done on domestic violence, very famous, study called the Minneapolis Domestic Violence Experiment. This was an early experiment trying to determine the best law enforcement response to a domestic violence call. So they looked at a multitude of reactions that law enforcement could provide in the face of domestic violence. And so they had 3 approaches. So they would either separate the couple each for 8 hours, they would make an arrest, or they would counsel the couple on options and outcomes. So like they would counsel them and say, you can get therapy. One of you or both of you can leave and go your separate ways. And ultimately what they did is look at those 3 different approaches. And then after a period of time, they would say, okay, out of the 3 approaches, which one did we, which of those approaches did we not have to return to their house as much or at all for domestic violence calls? Because, arguably, whichever one minimizes the amounts of times law enforcement gets called out there means it's minimizing the domestic violence. Okay. Ultimately, what the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment determined was that those who were arrested were less likely to commit a subsequent assault. Okay, so the counseling on options didn't really help, and then just separating them for a few hours didn't really help. But the arrest really saw a decrease in subsequent domestic violence incidences. And so this became the benchmark approach for how law enforcement approached this form of victimization. That, hey, the abuser has to be arrested and taken into custody and prosecuted. And that's what we see gets them to minimize, not eradicate. I mean, we don't eradicate all of them, but minimize subsequent offenses. We saw how that when this is ignored, this goes really poorly in the Gabby Petito and the Brian Landry situation, where, there was a young couple, they were on vacation. There was a history of domestic violence. They got into an altercation while they were traveling the United States. Law enforcement separated them, for a cooling down period. And shortly thereafter, Gabby Petito was murdered by her boyfriend. Law enforcement had intervened. According to the research, according to best practice, there should have been an arrest. If the arrest was made, the boyfriend would have stayed in custody. He would physically not have been in a place where he would have been free to get into another argument that escalates into a physical attack that ultimately escalated into a homicide. So as a result of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, many jurisdictions from state to state started introducing what we call a mandatory arrest policy in the case of intimate partner violence. That when there is a call for law enforcement and they show up and they see that there has been abuse, there's no discretion on the officer's part. The officer can't give them a cooling off period. The officer can't counsel them. The officer by law has to make an arrest, a mandatory arrest. Mandatory arrest policies occur where probable cause exists that intimate partner violence had occurred. So if there's presence of bruising, scratches, if there's disarray in the environment, like broken glass or furniture's been turned over or broken doors or things like that, that's your, obviously broken bones on a victim, that's your probable cause. And if any of those things are present in states with mandatory arrest, those states where there's the suspected abuser is going to be automatically arrested. There's no calming down, there's no separating, there's no counseling, it's automatic arrest. There's also an approach that is utilized now called dual arrest, and that's when both individuals are arrested for intimate partner violence in an intimate partner violence circumstance. Hey, we're law enforcement, we're coming after the fact. You both have bruises, you both have scratches. We don't know who started what. We don't know, so we're just taking you both, right? You're both misbehaving, you're both breaking the law, you're both causing a problem, so we're going to arrest both of you. There are also permissive policies, and this is where law enforcement is allowed to exercise discretion to determine in each instance whether or not an arrest should be effectuated. Prosecution has also changed the way in which they go about responding to domestic violence. Many victims, after the arrest, will either drop the charges or simply refuse to participate in the prosecution. They will refuse to cooperate and to testify. This has been the thorn in the side of law enforcement and prosecution for many a decade, because they feel like it keeps them from being able to move forward in protecting victims of domestic violence. That we know we're going to see one or the both of you coming through here again in the future because you won't testify and you won't press charges. And that's very frustrating to prosecution. It's very frustrating to law enforcement. And certainly it frees up the offender to perpetrate intimate partner violence in other relationships in the future, if he or she is never prosecuted. So they introduced other approaches like no-drop prosecution policies. So no-drop prosecution will pursue the case whether or not the victim cooperates, and they will utilize only evidence that can be gathered. The victim refuses to testify. Okay, well, we still have pictures of the scratches and the bruises and the broken bones. We have photographs of the scene and all the damage at the scene. We have the officer's testimony, the responding officer who came and saw you crying and cowering in the corner and, nursing wounds. So we will get the officer to testify. We won't need you to participate. We're going to get a conviction. It's a very controversial approach. Domestic intimate partner violence advocates say that it should be solely at the discretion of the victim, that you could be putting the victim at further risk by prosecuting without her consent, because eventually he'll get out and he'll come home and take it out on her, and which is obviously going to be physical violence, but could also escalate to homicide. Some argue that it's re-victimizing her because you're not giving her a voice. Some argue that, hey, she may be financially dependent on him. There are a lot of reasons maybe she doesn't want to prosecute. You are now taking her financial security and possibly the financial security of the children as well. So it's a very controversial approach. We can also use PFAs, or protection from abuse orders, which are also commonly known as restraining orders. And these are legal documents that literally place limitations on the offender about where they can go, that they can't have contact with the victim, they can't come into a certain geographic distance of the victim, and that if they violate the order, they are automatically arrested. Also, here in Pennsylvania, we recently, in the last several years, have new legislation that if you are being served with a protection from abuse order, you must relinquish all firearms to law enforcement. Law enforcement will put them in, take those firearms into custody. You may have them back once the court system is exhausted. I mean, if you are not convicted, you then go take possession of your firearms. But what we know, according to the research of victimization, is that if there is domestic violence in the house and the presence of a firearm, the odds of a homicide occurring just multiply exponentially, which is why we are removing firearms from the house. Also, another way we approach it is domestic violence shelters, so that victims have places that they can go where they can reside. They can get food, clothing, medical care if they need medical care, counseling, career placement, etc. Options that can get them out of that environment and into a safer place. We also have health services and health screening. This is something relatively new to the medical community in the past 2 decades. That now, when people go in, women in particularly go in for physical care and they show signs of trauma, medical services and personnel, such as nurses and doctors, are now legally mandated that they have to ask the individual, "Are you safe in the home?" And provide them with options and resources if the answer is no.